Welcome back to another episode of the Converge podcast, where we try to meet you at the intersection of mission and doctrine to help you live out your faith in a post-Christian world. My name is Steve.
My name is Nate.
And let's start talking this morning about the fact that, yes, we live in a clown world, but Christians need to be people of hope. I think that there is a reality going on, and I don't think a lot of people know how to deal with it, is the fact that we do live in some times that can be discouraging if you're a follower of Jesus Christ. There's a lot going on in the world, a lot of negative things going on in the world. We've even had a podcast, if you look through the archives, where we talk about that we are living in what has been labeled negative world, where at least the view of unbelievers, where the church is concerned, is going on. But today we want to talk about the fact that we have to be realistic and labeling what is going on in culture, what is going on in society. It's a lot of clownish things are going on. And so there is a temptation. And I think some people have given into the temptation to think, okay, we lose down here. It's nothing but doom and gloom. Some people, not me, would even call it being black-pilled. I just use the English language and call it discouragement. And it is hard to be encouraged, I think, about the future when you look at all that is going on in the world around us.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we do live in clown world. That term is it's kind of getting thrown around more and more. So if you hear it, here's what we're trying to talk about. Like, there's a lot of moral and cultural insanity going on in the world that we do need to recognize. Yeah, that's nuts. That didn't used to be like that. That's crazy. It doesn't do us any good to deny reality of a lot of things we can look around and saying our culture's falling apart in a lot of ways. But what do we do with that? Do we say, oh no, our culture's falling apart, the end is here, we have no hope? Well, what we want to do this podcast to say is no. Christians are fundamentally people of hope. And so, yeah, there's a place for being realistic, because you have to be realistic to kind of name and identify opposition that you're facing. But in Christ, we can do something about that.
Mm-hmm.
We have hope to face that opposition and triumph in Christ. And so I think it would be helpful just to spell out, all right, here's some of the clownish things happening in the world. These are real, these are happening, but our response to that is hope.
Yeah, if you think about it through a spiritual lens, the New Testament has a lot to say about spiritual warfare. And I know that we talk about being a culture warrior, culture wars, things of that nature a lot. But if you read specific instances in the New Testament, you could get very discouraged. Like when, the enemy Satan is called the prince of the air, he's called the god of this world. We have to, even if you just look at Ephesians chapter 6, when it talks about putting on the full armor of God, it's just this visual word picture about us preparing ourselves for battle. But then it says, you're going to be able to extinguish the fiery darts of the devil. And that's the word at the Rhema stage, which means specific words. But that can be taken to be very negatively. And so if you look at life moment by moment, instance by instance, then it can be very discouraging. But I think what we're going to try to do is we're going to talk about the specifics in a couple of different areas of what's going on. But it's almost like we're calling people to look at life almost at the meta level, where you're realizing that, yes, there are going to be some discouraging things. There are going to be some hard times. You're going to have to face some hard circumstances. But the Christian worldview is an overwhelmingly hopeful worldview. And if it's not hopeful, then I would go as far as to say it's not the Christian worldview. That even though you face hard times and you have to do some hard things, you are hopeful in every instance of it.
We always come at this from the perspective of God is sovereign. We just finished a full study of Joshua as a church, and one of the overarching things that came out from that study is the sovereignty of God, just in all things. Have hope, be courageous, be strong, because God's sovereign. He's got this. And so that's ultimately where our hope is in all these things.
Yeah, and the fact of the matter is we got to be honest. I said yesterday in a conversation that men are realistic, but men are optimistic. And the reason men are optimistic is because we're willing to do the hard things necessary to make life better for people. And I think a Christian man must be one that would admit, yes, the dogs of war are upon us, but we're going to have the time of our lives fighting the war. And society is, in many ways, crumbling around us. Even our current nation is crumbling around us. And so if you see that, don't see us having some kind of instinct of, remove yourself from from reality, deny what's actually going on, and just be optimistic for the sake of being optimistic while you deny what's going on. You're not crazy if you think we're heading towards or we're in the middle of some hard times, because you're not making this stuff up. What's going on, even in our own nation right now, is not normal. There are some very strange things, but being realistic is about taking the first step of being optimistic, because when you get real about things, you start forming plans as to what you can do.
Yep.
And yes, we can have hope, but it requires a plan.
Yep. And so here's us getting realistic. Like, we're going to identify some things. And also, I think these are things pastors need to just be honest about and identify more often. Yes, that's happening. It's crazy. So first overarching thing, family life is just being disintegrated in our culture. All right. I think that has been the goal of the sexual revolution. That has been the goal of communist ideologies, to do that. But they have made a lot of headway since the 60s, sure, but especially in the last few decades. LGBT, gender insanity, we talk about it a lot on this podcast, but we just want to name and identify that is clown world. It's absurd to think that a man can be a woman, that a woman can be a man. And often, and I think we're both in our 40s now, right? We're getting up there in age. Mm-hmm. We're still doing our best to be men that are tackling the issues in the world. But when you talk to younger people, like 20s, teenagers, you have to understand they have no perspective that this is weird and abnormal. Mm-hmm. Like, to them, their whole life has been spent in this clown world where all the authorities they see in the world, on TV, cultural institutions, all affirm that a man can be a woman, that a woman can be a man, that two men could be married, and that's a marriage. And so we kind of need to identify, no, that's clownish, because we have recollection of a time when that wasn't true.
Yeah, and I think for some people, they need to be honest enough to realize that you have children who don't know a time where gay marriage was a joke. Like, if I think about my childhood, the idea of two men getting married or two women getting married was laughable. Yep. And so we do our best to redeem that. We still treat it as laughable because it is a joke. It is a fake marriage, as Doug Wilson says, a mirage. It's not a marriage in any way, shape, or form. But your children don't remember a time when gay marriage wasn't the law of the land. And so when we've shifted, when the Obergefell decision made gay marriage the law of the land, that opened the floodgates. And so many people were like, oh, what do you care? It's not going to change anything that you do. You don't have to practice it. It became exactly what every pastor who was worth anything said it was going to become. It was the gateway drug to saying, oh, you don't have to take part in it, to, yeah, you do have to take part in it. We're going to sue all of the photographers. We're going to sue all of the bakers that won't be a part of it. Eventually they'll probably sue pastors who won't perform the wedding ceremonies. But then further than that, what do you think gender insanity, what do you think the door with that was? Is once you take away the distinction in marriage, and marriage sets very clear boundaries on what is a man, what is a woman. The man is the husband, the woman is the wife. Once the word egalitarianism works really well right there, because that's what it is. Yep. Once you make marriage egalitarian and remove the distinction, that opens the door for everyone to rethink what is gender, what is biological sex, to the extent where, okay, well, if medically feasible, we can change someone's biological sex. That's what we must do. And the gateway to that was the L and the G. And so we even live in a society now that is so just desperately stupid that even conservatives, people that call themselves conservatives, because they're not actually trying to conserve anything. They want the L, the G, and the B, and they want to say, okay, we got to conserve that and get rid of that T. It's like, how do you think we got to the T? Mm-hmm. We got to the T because we didn't fight LGB. We didn't stand our ground and refuse to bend on cultural forces coming in and saying, no, you got to compromise on your view of marriage, on your view of sexuality. And once you compromise on marriage and sexuality, you will compromise on gender.
Yeah, and it's all clownish, right? It's all a rejection of God's design. And the thing is, even if Like you think I'm good with the LGBT stuff, right? Sexual revolution has still wreaked havoc on our culture, and we see it. The younger people are really facing that right now. And just I saw a post on Facebook recently, or Twitter actually, by Anthony Esselin, who's a pretty insightful writer, and he was just kind of talking about how what a tragedy is now that kind of sexual promiscuity is just assumed. And so younger men and women can't even just enjoy getting to know each other in a healthy way. And we have really seen that in our society. It's wreaked havoc to where forming marriages is you just look at the stats. It's much more difficult now. We shouldn't kind of be glib about that. Like younger people really are having a genuinely harder time because of the clown world that has developed from the sexual revolution. They're having a harder time forming marriages. And rather than saying, oh, what's your problem? Get it together. We need to say, how can we help you? How can we help you be men, be women, and form families?
Out of wedlock births have skyrocketed. Kids are growing up in broken homes more than they ever had before. Yeah. When I was growing up, there was a smattering of kids that I knew who had divorced parents, and it was so odd and it was so unique. And the norm, and we're talking about 35 years ago, 35 years ago, the norm was a nuclear family. Now the norm is a broken home.
I just saw a news report in our own county that the busing system, one of the reasons it's having so many problems is the complication of bringing kids to multiple homes throughout the week because they're being shuffled around and it's making the thing fall apart.
Yeah, and we have to be honest that the sexual integrity of people who are heterosexual is deeply impacting a child's view of sex and marriage. Yeah. To where the more spouses that you have when you have children and you bring those blended families together, which don't hear what I'm not saying, God can redeem those stories. But God's redemption of those stories, because I think here's what pastors do. They look at everything through, I don't want to offend anyone away from Christ, when you end up hurting people and victimizing people in the long run because you don't stand up for what normalcy is. Broken homes, broken marriages, and blended families should not be treated as the norm, even if they become the highest percentage point. And let's say the majority culture becomes one of which there are broken marriages and broken homes and every family is blended. For the follower of Jesus Christ, we have an objective sexual ethic of one man, one woman, one lifetime, where a husband and a wife have children. They raise those children together to maturity, and then they send those children into the world to multiply and replicate what they were raised in from the get-go. We as a culture are disintegrating, socially speaking, and even with the view of sexual ethics that the next generation is going to have. Not because we don't have enough knowledge, but because our experience is not matching what the biblical ideal is. And so children are not going to reproduce sexual integrity just because you tell them to. If you are not fashioning it in front of them, the statistics are all the same. The greatest likelihood of a child to stay faithful to his spouse in the future is if he watches his parents be faithful to one another. And we've fallen into so many traps where heterosexual relationships are concerned that I think some people even feel hypocritical standing for heterosexuality as God's design for man and woman because they don't feel like they have the integrity because their experience hasn't matched the biblical ideal. And so when you do that and you let experience, even personal experience, dictate what you will and you won't stand for, then you can expect for everything to fall apart. I don't think 15 or 20 years ago, people assumed that their no-fault divorce because of irreconcilable differences was going to lead to little Johnny trying to become little Susie and little Susie trying to become little Johnny. But here we are. Yep. And so the only answer that we can have to get out of clown world is if followers of Jesus say, hey, we got to clean up our house, but here's the deal. And you might even read an article in Christianity Today saying, oh, well, if we don't have sexual integrity, we can't stand against the coming tide because that makes us hypocrites. Who cares? We can't just let things get worse and worse. Yeah. The answer to disease is not to let the disease continue. The answer to obesity isn't to not say anything because you feel personally obese. The answer to gender insanity, the answer to all sexual insanity is, I don't care where you are in your personal experience, you got to stand against it.
Yeah. And the church has so often treated these kind of failings as an opportunity for grace. And it is 100%. The grace of Jesus redeems. But we have to go from there to, okay, let's be ambitious about how we fix this. So we're going to get there on a lot of stuff.
Hold on. I think a lot of pastors have been caught flat-footed on the family life issue. And that's what cultivates what you're talking about. And I think the flat-footedness leads you to a place where somebody like J.D. Greear will echo something that Jen Wilkin wrote, the Bible whispers about sexual sin. And we've got to realize that comes from a place of you don't know how to form a strategy as to how to actually handle this in soul and society. So what you do is you just try to placate people and make them believe you're nice, and you think your niceties are going to fix it all. We're beyond that. We have to offend large groups of people now in order to win them to Christ because our current strategy isn't working.
Yeah, and it's hurting people. Like, not following God's design is hurting people, so we got to do better. All right, next area of clown world I want to talk about is economics. There's economic realities. We can look around and see opportunities for the middle class are being destroyed in our country, but all across the globe. And for a while there, I know, at least for me, I'm kind of the oldest of the millennial generation, right? I know you are too. Or, you're going to claim Gen X. Right, go ahead, do your Gen X
Gen
thing.
Xer.
All right.
I was born in 1980.
I don't know, there's some
that puts me
debate
in probably, I think, the final year. Nate's going to show you some Wikipedia article where somebody arbitrarily wrote it, and then I'll match him with an article that puts Gen X even into 1981 or 82.
So, from one Gen Xer to a millennial.
Amen.
There has been this kind of ongoing kind of joke for a while about, millennials just have unrealistic expectations about the world. They need to work harder. That's true, first of all. In general, that's pretty true. But the world has changed drastically in the last few decades that are true, especially even for the generations coming after us, for sure. And I could just identify some of those. Feminism really normalized two-income households. That you can just look at the stats. It's unquestionable that depressed wages for lower incomes that contributed to massive inflation, made it harder and harder to raise a family on one income. All kinds of costs have skyrocketed. The cost of college has absolutely skyrocketed, even where that credential is needed more and more, to where in past generations, you didn't need a college degree to have a good job that supported a family. Now you do for a lot of things. So debt's crushing people. And I think what's important is we are well past the time where we can kind of sit here and just mock younger generations that aren't making it financially. I think I need to look at them and say, like you're being dealt a raw deal here in clown world. It's not okay to have $100,000 in student debt and no prospect to pay that off. Now, you should have been smarter, of course. But at the same time, what 18-year-old is smart? Our society is failing these kids in a lot of ways.
I think baby boomer generation, I think Gen X, I think the older people need to be honest that they have cultivated and created an economy that is not sustainable for coming generations. And so when let's say you are 50, let's say you are 60 years old, when you look at a young person and say, well, you just need to work harder, quite frankly, that's an ignorant statement because they are not growing up in the same type of economy that you did. Yes, if you're a grandparent or a great-grandparent and you worked in the warehouse and you worked yourself up to an office and you worked yourself up to this, that, or the other thing, that's great. You could definitely do that in previous generations. You cannot do that in this generation in what I would say are most of the jobs that college graduates seek after. And so we have to be honest enough to say that the welfare state, that the entitlements that exist, the reason that people can procure $100,000 in student loans and then graduate and have to find a way to pay those off with a $20 an hour job, which is it's an impossible task, is because we came to a place as a society where we said everybody should be able to go to college. Well, that would have worked if human beings weren't the way human beings are. And the reason, if everybody wants to understand why college is so expensive, because you're going to take as much money as you can get. And the more the government was willing to dish out the loans, the more colleges could raise what they offer, and they could raise their prices. And so that's what they did. Just like if I was opening a car dealership, I would not sell a car for $20,000 if I could sell it for $50,000. That's just basic math. And so the economics that exists now is an economic system that was created because whether we were trying to get a foot up on things or whether or not we were convinced by a system that we all needed certain sized houses, we did this to ourselves in many ways.
And it's a bad system, because the other thing, a lot of people, we'll get into this more later when we talk about hope, but a lot of people's response to that to say, oh, you don't need college. Well, that's not a good idea at all. There's a lot of things you actually do need it for. And one thing we're very passionate about is Christian college is a great experience. So that is a clown world that kids are facing just insurmountable debts to have a quality Christian college experience. It's not good.
Yeah, it's not good that it's as expensive as it is. But I also understand why it's as expensive as it is because of the competition and all of that. But we can't afford education at this point. It's undoable. And the answers to it are not as simple as everybody thinks it is. So many people are like, well, hey, Village Church just, well, that, which is a tough one. I don't want to be too offensive on my view on that. But it's also, I think, I heard somebody tell us one time, why doesn't Village Church just start a college?
Oh, yeah.
Well, because number one, I don't think people understand how much I'm adding a second full-time job onto my plate would be. But also because no one would come. An accredited Bible Institute isn't the replacement.
Look, we'll get there. Some people should be plumbers. My point is just not everyone can be. The other thing is, and we really need to address this, housing has become unaffordable.
What was the stat you showed me yesterday that the housing prices have gone up 40% since 2019?
Yeah, just a couple of years. And I just heard in the last 10 years, they're 70% more unaffordable.
Wow.
And so, you'll hear people say things like, well, interest rates have been way worse than 10% before, because they're going to be 10% pretty soon here. Well, yeah, and houses were $50,000.
It was
or less.
I can't remember. So my parents, I was asking them about their house. So I think they were, it was like the Carter administration when they bought their house, when interest rates were just bonkers. I mean, I'm talking like 15, 17%, something like that. But they also paid $39,000 for their house.
Yeah. Look, one of the first house I ever bought in Lynchburg was $79,000. All right. It's different. And it was fine. Like, it was a good house for us. That doesn't exist. And that's, you're talking about government regulations. Starter houses don't exist anymore. You say, oh, these kids, they just expect too much house. Not true for multiple reasons. One, those houses don't exist because of government regulations. Two, you look at houses that are $300,000 and they're not that nice anymore and unaffordable on one
income. A house
income.
that you would have paid, and I know this personally, a house that in 2012 was $100,000 is now $270,000. People need to realize that.
Yeah. So again, and a lot of why I'm saying this is because we need to identify clown world's real. The next generation, which is our kids, our grandkids for some, are facing real issues, and it does us no good to dismiss them.
And wages, and the thing about houses, some people want to retort, well, in 1972, I only made $5 a week. Well, when you keep in mind the rapid growth of housing prices, even specifically in our county, you also need to keep in mind that wages are completely flat.
Yeah.
And so what the housing market does in our own county is that it forces, if you want to buy a house in our county, parents don't see a way around both the mother and the father working. And trust me, I know some of you have a great job and the husband brings home a tremendous amount of money, but you can't put your situation on everybody's shoulders. I want to talk about people that are just getting into their career. Yeah. Starter jobs do not pay enough for people to live, especially when you look at the fact that apartment living right now is higher than mortgages, to the extent where people can't even afford a one-bedroom studio apartment at this point. And so we've got to be honest that it is a very discouraging time to even think about starting a family.
Yep. All right. Failed leadership is another kind of big topic just across our society that just increasingly you look at and you see that's clown world. You can start with our president. All right, we have a president who is mentally incapacitated. And everyone in our world, our institutions, the media just kind of moves on like everything's fine. There's another thing where we need to say, no, this is not normal. Like, realize we've got teenagers now who they've just now started becoming politically aware, and they need to understand, no, this is not something that just comes around every few years.
Yeah.
Like, no, our society is broken that we could have a man at this highest level that is, infantile in the way he goes about life because he's not there. It
was controversial when Ronald Reagan was elected president because of his age. And I think a lot of people don't realize they thought Reagan was too old. Biden was older on Inauguration Day than Reagan was when he left office.
Yep.
And it's non-normative, especially when you have a president who cannot give a coherent speech, who cannot answer questions from the crowd. We live in a bizarre time where the presidency of the United States is concerned, where this is not normal. And people need to act that way. People need to be verbal about that. People need to be willing to look at everybody in their life and say, it is not normal that we have a president with dementia.
Yeah.
That we have a president that is not leading the country right now.
Yeah. Who is leading the country? You have to ask those questions. And you see failed leadership everywhere. I mean, one thing that is just so frequently obvious is our failed military leadership. You just see them parading out, women or men that are pretending to be women in high-ranking places. Just the LGBT agenda throughout that. It's just like that's not normal.
Yeah.
These are major cultural institutions that didn't used to be like that.
We're asking our young men and unfortunately our young women to sign up for military careers, going into military where we're now appointing trannies as generals and admirals, where we're now seeing officers in the military come out and in the open, a man pretending to be a woman.
They're developing combat flight suits for pregnant women.
Like that's insanity. It's insanity.
Yeah.
When you look at the leadership of our military, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for veterans. My father is a war combat veteran, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for those that have sacrificed so much for our freedoms. But we have to have an accountability structure where the Western civilization values, which are very much Christian values, and just the adherence to reality itself is something that we put pressure on. And we have to have a frank conversation as to how many of our young men and women we're willing to sacrifice at the altar of Moloch when leaders are, quite frankly, going to get them killed.
Yeah, we have to be able to look at the jokes that is our country, that is what the military is doing, and say that's disrespectful to everyone who's served. Mm-hmm. That's disrespectful to a heritage of service in our country. And we're seeing that in the abysmal recruitment efforts. I mean, you just talk about clown world. We can't get anyone to serve in the military because so many people do understand that it is supporting all kinds of insane agendas throughout the world. That's not a good place for our country to be for multiple reasons we don't even need to go into.
And then even if we elect conservative leadership, they're too afraid to actually do anything.
Yeah, and that's been really disappointing. I'm glad that Governor Youngkin is our governor and not the other guy, but he's been a total coward on a lot of these issues. It's very frustrating. I still hope for improvement in that area in our state. But we got so many conservative leaders that won't even just stand up for simple things like, standing against the LGBT insanity. Mm-hmm. Leadership in the country, look at our schools. I think this is just worth bringing up here. I mean, schools are supposed to be a cultural institution in a community. And you go in any school in our areas, there's gross sexual perversion flags, which is what you should call them, out in display in front of the students. That should not happen. It's inappropriate. We should not treat that as normal. And I'm never going to treat that as normal. We literally, and I'm saying the word literally in the proper use of the term, caught librarians in our county giving out pornography to children last year, and no one cares.
Yeah, I mean, and it's been exposed to the school boards that stuff is in our schools for elementary students. And not only did the school board not care, but here's the thing, everyone still marched to the bus stop the next day.
Yeah.
And it's just like, where are we as a society where we don't do anything, where we just say, well, that probably won't. It used to be, oh, that's in California. Then it was, oh, that's somewhere else. Then it was, oh, that's only Northern Virginia. Now it's your school, and you still won't do anything about it.
No one was fired. There was no riots in the streets.
Mm-hmm.
It's clown world.
Yeah.
All right.
Of course, COVID exposed our leadership terribly. It's so funny that we now live in a society where someone tells me that their physician said something, and for me, that doesn't really, that used to. If you think back, before COVID, now somebody was like, "Oh, your doctor told you to do this." Well, then that's serious. Now it's like I question. Well, can you even trust that? Because your doctor was getting paid $50 a jab to give you a vaccine that has now caused myocarditis in so many people and been proven to be 100% ineffective in fighting the virus that it was supposed to be designed for anyway. And no matter how you look at the COVID hysteria, how you look at just the experience of living through, a pandemic or whatever we're going to call it, you have to admit that the facts are in. And all leaders across the board failed.
Yeah. And there's been no accountability. And that's so frustrating. I mean, here's the most damning stat to this that I see. As you look at the current rates of the latest COVID booster, it's like 3%. All right. What that tells me is the whole country knows that it's a joke. It failed. It didn't work. But we're just not going to hold anybody accountable for that.
Yeah.
Clown world.
Yeah, complete. I mean, we even found out that in the hospitals that they were getting bonuses for putting people on ventilators. Yeah. And we found out that the ventilators were literally blowing people's lungs up and killing them. And no one has been held accountable. No one has lost a medical license. No one in the government has had to go to jail for it. It's just complete clown world.
Yep. Last kind of big category. We could probably go on forever talking about clown world.
Nate and I can discourage you all day long.
Well, hope is coming. Hope is coming. But I do want to talk about persecution. Because when you talk about negative world, I know people are funny about that word because, hey, there's Christians that are killed for their faith in this world this day all the time. So, and that is serious persecution. But even in this country, you should honestly say what is persecution, and Christians are facing that more and more as the Christian faith is not viewed in high esteem, or it's actually negative to be a Christian. We're seeing persecution in a lot of ways. It could be as simple as social status, being called bigots. That's a form of persecution, but it's actually a lot more serious than that in terms of economics. I mean, we're facing a future, and it is here now, where our children are not going to have certain fields open to them because of their Christian conviction, especially in law, medicine, a lot of social services, even in a lot of teaching, which is a huge profession. And whether it's, the Christians are filtered out because of their convictions, they can't sign on to something needed for licensure, or sometimes, and this is more so in the teaching profession, I'm hearing more and more from teacher friends, it's just made miserable. Their Christian convictions make their job just unbearable because of the things that they just can't put up with. And so, there's very real persecution happening on the church in clown world.
Yeah, and if you just want a specific example, where is this going on? I mean, there's a cake maker in Colorado who has had to spend the last decade of his life in court because he would not bake a cake for a gay wedding ceremony. And he's doing it because of his faith in Jesus Christ. And it's that is specifically, he has been persecuted over and over and over and over for his faith. And it's only going to become more problematic with time.
Yep. So that's clown world. So I think that's enough of the discouragement. Where's our hope?
Well, that's the conclusion of part one of a two-part episode on how to have hope in a clown world. We've got you good and discouraged in this episode. We've told you everything that is wrong, but please join us for the second episode where we're going to talk to you about how you can actually have hope in a clown world.